Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name's Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And this week, we're done with spooky season. We did a whole month of spooky games that Mike really took the reins on and did a great job. Thank you so much, Mike, for taking us through all the spooky games.
It just got so scary.
I know, and I don't play spooky games, and I know you're not huge into spooky games, but you certainly played more spooky games than me, so it was very nice to have you lead those ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. I'm going to try to get more into spooky gaming over the course of the year, so I'll be ready for next year.
Yeah. You can build up your spooky games list for next year.
I have a episode idea in the bank in my head that involves a guest, so I need to read their book and contact them. Then I know the guest, right. So this would be a cool thing for Halloween next year. Ooh.
Oh, yeah, let's do it. Okay, but now that we're done with spooky season, we're back to The Ultimate History of Video Games, Volume 2 by Stephen L. Kent. We do this kind of book club style where we read a chapter or two and then sort of discuss it. So you should definitely go buy this book because it's really good, and we're not going to cover everything in it because it's too dense, and we're not trying to make a podcast version of this book. But it is really good, and you should go buy it.
That's right. And this chapter we're covering today is called Chapter 8, Mostly Dead, The Afterlife of the Arcade Business. And this, Tyler, might be my favorite video game history chapter in the book so far. I'm going to say so
really?
far.
Okay, this is Chapter 8, right? So we're like a third of the way through the book now.
Yeah. We're about a third of the way. I'm not a big arcade player, but because arcades to me are kind of like the Wild West of video games, and they were trying so much stuff out that it's really exciting to read about this. And for example, the thing that stood up in my mind was in the fighting games episode I did, the early fighting games, all the experimentation that ended up with what fighting games are now happened in arcades. Arcades or home PC in very small markets, So it's cool to me that we covered this, and we covered the big fall, not the crash in Japan, because that's a separate thing. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But this is the big one, what people consider the big oh no. And here goes arcades. Kent actually gets into this right off the bat and makes a really good point that I had never really thought of before, which is, when was the golden age of arcades? Because he looks at it mostly from different people's points of view. Because to a lot of people, if you loved Pac-Man, then you thought the early 80s was probably your favorite time. But meanwhile, there's people that were born in the early 90s that loved, not born in the early 90s, but born in the 80s, growing up in the early 90s, that thought Street Fighter was the golden age of arcades.
Yeah.
And there's an argument there. It's not really it's an argument for a genre. It's not an argument for sales, but it's definitely an argument there,
Yeah. If you ask me, and this is completely my opinion, I think I would say the golden age of arcades, the best time to be a player of arcade games was probably the late 80s, early 90s, right around that Street Fighter era. Because I think that's when a lot of the early experiments had sort of paid off and became really good games, really good entries in those genres. And there wasn't as many, I don't want to say garbage, but there wasn't as much garbage to sift through, right? That's what I think. So I think those early 90s when arcades were still they were the height of technology too, because consoles were not quite there yet in terms of level of arcade. That was always a selling point for new consoles, was oh, it's arcade quality, right? You wouldn't try to sell a console with that tagline now. So I think it's that late 80s, early 90s. That's what I think. What do you think?
I tend to be very, because I don't know a lot about arcade. I wasn't around, I was sort of going to a bowling alley and playing arcades as a kid. Me
neither. So I'm just making things up, I guess.
I think I like what he did because it takes a lot of the thinking out of it and the opinions out of it, which is he talked, this is Stephen Kent, talked to arcade owners, and all of them had their different things, but we're going to focus on the money of when was the most profitable time to be an arcade owner. And that's what Stephen Kent, because I honestly don't know. I would think if you'd asked me before I read this, I probably would have been Pac-Man is what I would have said. When really in my mind, I was probably thinking Miss Pac-Man. That's what I was probably thinking.
You just have a whole bar full of Pac-Mans and you would have been fine.
Welcome to Pac Bar, full of Pac-Mans.
Yeah.
Yep, it's Pac-Mans as far as the eye can see. But I like that Stephen L. Kent in the book kind of centers it on this. So this is a fun quote. It's from Kevin Bacchus, who is the Senior Vice President of Entertainment and Game Strategy at Dave & Buster's. And that name should sound familiar because he helped found Xbox, as we know it. But his quote on page 161, I'm going to read real quick because I really like it. It says, quote, 1972 through 1985. Initially, I was going to say 1982 to 1982. That was the year of the peak before the crash. In all seriousness, the golden age of arcades, in my opinion, comprises the period of growth from the start of Pong, November 1972, and up until the US release of the NES at the end of 1985, which ushered in the end of the era. And I think it's a good sum up. It's definitely going to be different to a lot of people because the next person, Tom Russo, says 1982, like 1980, 1982. And then the person after that is like, there was no death. It's still going, like technically, you know, because it's like kind of building up again now as we know it. But yeah, the big money making years that we're mostly going to be talking about is 1978, I believe, to 1982. That's kind of like the golden for money. That's
okay. So in terms of money, because you couldn't, Atari was around then, but like there was no real home console. Not a lot of home console stuff going on. And Atari was like adjusted for inflation like $1,000 or $900 in today's money, right? So yeah, Atari was not cheap.
The Atari wasn't really in it. Atari was like, because you had Atari and you had Atari clones. We're going to talk about it in a second. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But the Howard McAuliffe, I think it's to say McAuliffe is how you say his name. It's his quote on page 1962 is so heartbreaking because he talks about how arcades are coming back. And this was like a quote given in early 2020, right before COVID hit. Oof. So there's actually correction in the book. That's like, hey, he gave me this quote in like January 2020. It's like, ugh. But I mean, you know, reading this chapter really made me think I want to retire and open a barcade, or should I say a bar/arcade, you know?
Yeah.
Because I think that's like the dream, you know?
I agree. Let's do it together. Let's open up a bar/arcade together.
Call it John Bird or Jay Glames, something
Jay
like
Glames.
that.
John Glames. John Glames' place.
Jay Glames' place, where everybody knows Jay Bird, where everybody knows your Glames. That's it. We just did it.
Jay Bird's, where everybody knows your claims.
So Kent actually spends some time on Nolan Bushnell a lot at the beginning of this chapter, and we've talked about Nolan Bushnell at length. So I won't spend too much time on it. If you want more details about Nolan Bushnell, definitely read Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 1. There's a lot of detail on him there. We also cover it in our episodes too, if you just want a quick, shorter version that's less detailed. But again, the first book has it. His thing with Bushnell didn't necessarily like invent video games, even though he's called like the father of video games. It's because his like entrepreneurial spirit and the industry and the right place, right time. And that's what Stephen L. Kent describes in his book. For example, and this was something I kind of always forget about, he got started by taking Space War, our favorite game to yell.
Space War!
And he turned it into an arcade game called Computer Space. So he just straight up like copied a game. And then he like founded a business with Bill Nutting, who owned a company called Nutting Associates, which was like a video game company at the time, a small one. And they just went into business together. And that's how he got started. And that business, like it didn't do so well, Computer Space. And that's what caused Bushnell to leave and go to Atari. And go and create Atari with Ted Dabney. And then you have Pong and it just kind of snowballs from there. That's the very quick TLDR history. Bushnell is also important for this chapter too, because arcades were just all about stealing in the 70s and 80s. And there were so many knockoffs or jackals that Bushnell called them. And I think it's just really funny because when any industry starts, there's people that just try to steal it.
The jackals.
The jackals are here. The last thing that Bushnell did that is mentioned by Stephen Kent in this chapter is he created the Chuck E. Cheese brand and Chuck E. Cheese pizza places, giving children and teenagers a place to hang out and like play games. And like it essentially fostered arcades in this time. In the book, they have a quote that I've never really heard before. And that was Bushnell saying that he wanted the Chuck E. Cheese to be like, quote, a scaled down version of the Enchanted Tiki Room at Disneyland, which now that I think about it, he kind of nails it. Like, did you ever go to the Tiki Room at Disneyland?
No, I don't. I've only been to Disneyland in my adult years. I never went to Disneyland as a kid, so I don't have any nostalgia at all. But I don't even know what the Enchanted Tiki Room is. I couldn't tell you where it is at Disneyland, and I've been to Disneyland a few times now. So
this is going off the dome here. This is one of those places where I can't tell if I've been there because I was at Disneyland when it was open as a child, but I don't remember. But I knew of this whenever I hear of it. It's a room that's like it's like you go into this tiki room that has like tiki masks all over the walls, and it's very like tiki inspired decor. So you have like palm trees and all that stuff, and think like, think like a early Jimmy Buffett fans, a little older than Jimmy Buffett, because it's like the 50s. And then all the birds in the room and the masks start singing, and it's like a little show, like a little dinner show.
Like a Chuck E. Cheese, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And it's pretty much exactly it. Like that's Bushnell ripped the Enchanted Tiki Room, added a rat with a band, and now you have Chuck E. Cheese.
All right.
Yeah, I really want to know. I got to ask my mom if we went there, because I feel like I did as a little kid, because I was always be like the Enchanted Tiki Room. Like I've been doing that my whole life. And then I'm like, did I actually go there? Or was this just like, there's a good chance I watched the VHS promo, because I would watch it a lot growing up in Alaska. And I put this in my own head. It was on the Pleasure Island area of Disneyland, I believe, which used to be like an adult themed area. And they like it was like bars instead. And they'd have like a New Year's party. And essentially it was a place for people to go drinking at Disneyland, without their kids.
Now it's just California Adventures where you do that.
And now that's California Adventure, yeah. Or if you go to Florida, you go to Epcot and you drink around the world. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It just changed. But yeah, I think this was a fun little fact that I was like, oh, I didn't even think about this, that it really is. Chuck E. Cheese is just the landlocked rat band tiki room. So yeah, I thought that was a cool little aside there. After that in the chapter, though, Stephen kind of covers Taito and Space Invaders. And Taito was founded by a Ukrainian immigrant named Michael Kogan in 1953. And it initially was like an import company for jukeboxes and vending machines to like post-war Japan. But Taito's first game was also a copy of a different game. It was a copy of an Atari game called Space Race. And they copied Space Race, and the name they chose was Astro Race. So it wasn't even really trying. Like,
oh man, all these space games that are getting ripped off.
Yeah, and then they made their own original space game, which was Space Invaders in 1978, and that is the second most popular arcade game of all time by sales. It sold 360,000 units. The first one was Pac-Man at 400,000 units. If you want to know the scale, well, like Asteroids, the game Asteroids has only sold 70,000 units. So that's how far those first and second place
Is that the third best-selling arcade? Oh, okay.
I will do the top 5 later on down the line, because in a footnote, he has the top 5 of there, which I thought was pretty cool.
Okay.
And the cool part is there is a like this golden age time game on that. So we'll get there in a second. But now we really have like the big money years in arcades. It's kind of like the really short timeline he gives. We're kind of skipping over some stuff because you should buy the book, like Tyler said. But
a lot of this is covered in the first book too.
It really is. Like he kind of, I think, is like setting this up for people who haven't read the first book. Although I don't know why you would read the second one and not read the first one. Like if you're a fan of video games, you should just read them both, right? Mm-hmm. But who knows? The start is 1978 with the release of Space Invaders. That's kind of the beginning of the golden age. And then we get a big push in 1980 when a bunch of hits come out. You got Defender, Tempest, Donkey Kong, and Frogger, all released by different companies. And then in 1982, the final year of the arcade golden age, according to Money, remember we're talking about money, we have the group of MIT students that created a PAL board for Pac-Man that made it Miss Pac-Man. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, but the gist of the story is Midway bought the rights to these boards that these MIT students made, and they just started making their own new cabinets that were cosmetic cabinets that looked like Miss Pac-Man. Inside, it was seriously a Pac-Man board with the MIT students' PAL board just on top of it. They didn't even really have to do anything. They just added this part to the manufacturing process, and that was it. Quick aside, this is also the moment in the book that I remember Stephen L. Kent mentioning Walter Day and Billy Mitchell of famous Twin Galaxies video game world record keeping and subsequent controversies. I don't think we've talked about it. Have we talked about it before?
I don't think so. You're talking about Billy Mitchell and Steve Wiebe, or is this a different guy?
Walter Day is the person that founded Twin Galaxies, which is the arcade.
Gotcha. I know what you're. I know who you're
and
talking
then Billy Mitchell is the now very much in hot water controversy king of like record keeping video games. And I just want to take a quick aside to say that I love this stuff. Like, it's some of my favorite gossip on the internet is this weird old arcade gossip from the 80s. I love King of Kong. I love all the documentaries. I watch every documentary about it. But unfortunately, because it's just gossip, like, I don't know if and when we'll get into it on the podcast. I think it would be kind of fun to do a break where we just review like King of Kong and talk about the movie, because I love that movie so much to the point that I think I rewatched it like a couple months ago.
So fun.
But I am so stoked that it is at least getting mentioned in passing in Ultimate History Video Games Volume 2. Like it was really fun to read that to me because I'm like, he's acknowledging it. Because I think even I should ask him about this next time. If we get him on the podcast again, I want to ask Stephen L. Kent if like his thoughts on this whole thing, if he just mentioned it to be like, yes, this exists. Because he talks about the Time Magazine Day, which is the big historical event where all the guys, like the famous picture of all of them by their machines and like their world record they have. And I think that it really is the only quote unquote historical thing you could really talk about it, because the rest of it is just gossip, like straight up. But I love it. I love it so much. If you love it too, email us and tell me how much you love it so we can be like, you should talk about it, because I will drop my history hat in a heartbeat and put on my gossip hat. Okay, I'll do it. I'm not afraid. So
Codex Hot Goss Edition.
Yeah, Codex History of Video Game Gossip. So now we have the decline. 1982 is kind of the end, which is a bummer. But Kent makes a joke about Froyo that I think we should all take the time to acknowledge is very good and to value that joke, because his joke he makes about Froyo is like Froyo was kind of a thing for like 5 years and then it ended and there wasn't really a reason, you know? And I think that's kind of the thing he's saying about like the video game like ending. Obviously we could say home consoles, but the decline in 82, because NES came out in 85, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the US. We're talking about US release. We're not talking about the Japanese release yet. So that would mean there's a good 3 years where arcades are on the decline with really no big reason. And it's really heartbreaking because there's a point in the book where they talk about how this arcade owner is like, my numbers are down. I can't pay my employees. What am I going to do? And it's just like, no one knew and no one saw it coming. But when we mentioned the decline in 1982, I think it's important to also mention that it's just Western culture, aka Europe and North America. Japanese arcades are still doing fine at this point. There are some really like I just said, like those heartbreaking quotes on page 169 and 170, because it just fell off and no one prepared for it. They thought this was like a gravy train that just keeps going, you know? And it stopped being gangbusters and hotcakes, which is just really, really sad.
We should sell at our bar/arcade, gangbusters and hotcakes.
We're gonna make something for gangbusters. We can sell hotcakes, it's just pancakes, but gangbusters, we should create some sort of dish that's like a gangbuster. And we should also have a gravy train, like a train that comes to your table that's full of gravy.
Yeah.
Obviously, which is a terrible idea for arcades. There's electronics everywhere. It's a horrible reason, but we're going to do it because we believe in our business. Okay. So Kent then points out, as far as sales go, that the boom ended in 1982. And the only arcade on the top 5 list of arcade games by machines sold after 1982, this is what I was talking about earlier, Street Fighter 2.
Oh, yeah.
Also, the top grossing arcade machines of all time in order are Pac-Man at number 1, Space Invaders at number 2, then it's Street Fighter 2, then Donkey Kong, and then Miss Pac-Man. So just when you thought Pac-Man couldn't dominate harder, they put a PAL board on an original Pac-Man machine and they get in the top 5.
Dang.
Yeah, it's pretty
I thought
nuts.
Miss Pac-Man had done better than the original Pac-Man, but I guess I was wrong.
No, I like Miss Pac-Man, I think, more. That's the one I played more. When I thought I played Pac-Man as a kid, I was really playing Miss Pac-Man.
Me too.
I like them. I should actually try to like play them side by side. I don't know. There's a couple of old arcades nearby. I could go try it out because I'm curious now. A new perspective that we haven't discussed before that Kemp brings up, though, on page 171 are shopping malls and arcades, which I've never really like thought about it. But really, yeah, like now arcades are in shopping malls. But during the boom, arcade owners moved in, like sometimes even having multiple arcades with like competing arcades in the same mall. Dang. But with the market declining, though, you see arcade owners leave the mall or get out because of the like business altogether. I guess what I'm saying about this part I read is I didn't realize how expensive leases in malls are, which seems odd.
Super expensive.
Because malls seem like they've been on the decline for like 15 plus years at this point, you know?
Yeah.
But people keep saying that. But then if you go to a mall during the holidays, you're just like, oh my gosh, it's still real. It's still very real. You know?
Yeah, I think the overall market for malls has gotten smaller, but the malls that are still here, I think they're doing okay, or they will find an equilibrium where there won't be as many malls, but they will still be busy malls, you know?
Yeah, there's a mall up in Bellevue, Washington, which is where Microsoft, one of the cities that they pretty much have built for Microsoft, and they do this big Christmas like parade thing, and it's like it's an event for the city.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, and so that's how the mall brings people in. But it's like 30 straight days. The entire month of like end of November, Black Friday to Christmas at this mall is where they make all their money. And I think that's just the business model now. That's just how it is. Probably the same way flowers companies on like Valentine's Day. They're like, this is going to be a busy day for us, a busy week. So maybe that's how the malls have survived the whole time. But the arcades, certainly not doing too well. Mm-mm. Now, you may be like me at this point, though, in the book and asking yourself, what's going on with our favorite animatronic rat during all of this?
That was going to be my next question. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, this is where everything changed in Chuck E. Cheese's business strategy. First of all, Bushnell was blamed, actually, for the downfall of arcades and how it affected Chuck E. Cheese. And he actually left Chuck E. Cheese in 1984. And that's when the big shift happens. That's when the great shift from video games to quote unquote redemption games or prize games happens. Gambling for children. That's when that starts.
I know. You're talking about like games that give you tickets, right? That you can then take to a counter and like buy things with.
So I didn't put this together because I grew up in the early 90s. I was born in 88. So early, like I was going to Chuck E. Cheese around like 92 through 97, when I'll talk about this later when I could go. But it was like, that was all prize games. It was all about the tickets. They had an arcade upstairs at the Anchorage, Alaska one that was like where the older kids hung out. And that was more like video games, like Tekken and the fighting games and stuff like that. But like it was all prize games for me. Yeah. I guess in my mind, I never realized that before 1984, it was all just video games.
Well, and to my little kid brain during the years, because I was there, a couple of years after you, like, the games that didn't give tickets, not worth playing. I didn't even give them a second thought.
Me too. I was like, I had that in the brain. Like, I gotta get Tootsie Rolls.
I had the prize that I wanted, the like 500 ticket stupid thing, and like, and those things only cost like $2, but I would definitely play $20-$30 worth of video games to get one.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's really like this was the big fact for me. I think that made me in the business of arcades. Is really interesting to me now. I think this is more interesting as an adult, definitely than as a kid. Because, like you said, like we didn't think about how the thing I was trying to get for 500 tickets was $2, but back then it was so big. Is that this is how we have arcades now? Is the redemption game or prize games? Like that's the only
Dave
reason.
and Buster's. You don't get physical tickets anymore, but they put them on a little card for you, right?
We're gonna get into that in a second.
Yes,
too. That's why I think this is like such a good chapter to me. Is because it's talking about a lot of stuff I know, like Dave and Buster's. We're going to talk about barcades in a second and the controversy around that word barcade, which when I read this, I was like, wow, it's cool to read a history book on like something I know already, but that goes into more depth of like why this is a thing. So that's, I think, why I really, really dig this chapter. But like I mentioned before, though, Japan is doing great, even through this arcade-wise. Joyopolis, not Joyopolis, but Joypolis, Sega's arcade amusement park chain, is going gangbusters at this point. Like we won't see them close until Sega's like great reconciliation in 2000 to 2002 because of the Dreamcast when they decided to go software only. That's why Joypolis closes. But yeah, so the next section in this chapter is called Consolidation, and it's pretty much about what happened to all these manufacturers because there's all these people making arcades, right? And most of them seem to actually have been bought by a company called WMS Industries, which is formerly known as Williams Electronics Incorporated, which is still kicking it today because, once again, of the power of gambling. They make slot machines. But WMS bought both Atari Games and Trade West. Trade West, if you didn't know, owned like companies like Cinematronics that had Dragon's Lair. So they're like, that's what's really confusing about these arcade companies too, is they all own each other and they all buy each other's IPs. So WMS bought a lot of IPs at this time. When things were folding, they bought a lot of different companies. But for all you fighting fans out there, Warner Brothers actually acquired one of the last holdouts in the crash, Midway, in 2009. And that's the reason you have games like Mortal Kombat and Injustice still coming out fairly regularly now. Midway survived way longer than any of these other companies did, but they still folded because Midway was pinball. I remember Blitz, they had some
like
really
NFL
good
Blitz.
Yeah, NFL
Well,
Blitz.
it's not NFL anymore because they lost the license. But
yeah, but they had some really good 90s video games midway, and then they kind of fizzled out in the 2000s. But they were bought by Warner Brothers, and when they bought Midway, they got Mortal Kombat, and that's how we got Injustice, because they were like, we have Mortal Kombat, we have DC's license, we can just combine the two. Genius idea right there. But at this point in the book, Kent talks about something near and dear to my heart, which is GameWorks.
Ooh, and that's in Seattle, right?
It's in Seattle. There's a GameWorks in Seattle. So I'm actually intentionally going to skip this part. Why? Because I want to cover GameWorks.
Gotcha.
I'm going to go there and do like a man on the street and then report in to the podcast. I think that'd be really fun. Ideally, Tyler and I can go together. We're trying to make that work.
That's the dream.
But I'm really afraid they're going to close before we can get this trip put together. But Kent actually briefly touches on Disney Quest here as well. And if you don't know what Disney Quest is, that is their arcade, Disney's arcade theme park. And they tried to make this in the late 90s. It started in Florida and they made it to Chicago. And then they were going to do a Philadelphia branch and they stopped. And Disney Quest is interesting because it was VR focused before VR became like a thing again.
Yeah, it was like too early. It was cool, but it was like too early, I think.
Yeah. This whole concept of Disney Quest, we're kind of going to brush over too, because it could be its own episode. But if you're really interested in this now, though, there is a very, very good episode of the show Defunct Land on YouTube called Defunct Land, The Failure of Disney's Arcade Chain Disney Quest, that really goes into this in depth and does a really good job, to the point where, like, if we did an episode on it, they would be a big source for me, which I'm kind of like, with that, I'm like, maybe you should just watch this video and we won't do an episode, you know? Or we try to get that guy on. That'd be really cool too.
Ooh,
That's kind of more my idea. But instead of like having these, if there's a great video about something, I would much rather have the person that made that video on our podcast than just do an episode on their video. But have you seen Defunct Land, Tyler?
I have like kind of watched a few things here and there, but I definitely watched this whole video on Disney Quest when I saw that you'd linked it here, because it was fascinating. And I think it was just, it's interesting because it was a little bit before its time with technology and a little bit after its time with arcades. Like, it was too late to the arcade game and too early to the VR game. That's what that's sort of my takeaway.
That's a really good way to put it, actually. That's a very good way to put it. It's Defunct Land is one of my favorite YouTube channels, and if you should definitely check it out if you haven't, because they just go through old theme park rides and just like old theme park things in general, which I always find really interesting, because I'm like, this was my childhood and we're talking about it. You know, nostalgia. It's great. That's why you're listening to this podcast, probably. Okay. The next section is called Eat, Drink, Play. And it got me really excited because it's about Dave & Buster's. And I, as a kid growing up in Washington, did not have Dave & Buster's when I grew up here. Now we have them. And I was always one of those things where I was like, oh, I want to go there. Like, growing up as a kid in Alaska, I always wanted to go to the chain restaurants that I didn't see. That I would see on TV that weren't there. When I grew up in Washington, I always wanted to go to Dave & Buster's because they had commercials on TV for Dave & Buster's, and I couldn't go because they weren't in Washington. But now I've gone and I like it a lot. But the origins of Dave & Buster's, I never really looked up or never really looked into. And we kind of get that from Stephen L. Kent here. A real quick brief, again, we're skipping a lot of the details, is in 1975 in Little Rock, Arkansas, Dave Corriveau had a saloon called Cash McCools. 3 years later, James Buster Corley, Buster was the nickname, had a bar called Buster's that moved in next door. They decided to join forces and they moved to Dallas, and that's where Dave & Buster's came from.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Cash McCools, what a cool name for a bar.
That's a really cool name for a bar. But yeah, so Corley ran the bar, and Corriveau was in charge of the games and entertainment. So this section, honestly, to me was kind of strange because it almost felt like a advertisement for Dave & Buster's. Did you read into that? Did it feel that way to you, Tyler?
No, I don't remember it feeling that way. No.
Okay, I don't know why it felt that way to me, but maybe it's because they had the Dave & Buster's like quotes all over. It's not an ad for Dave & Buster's. It's definitely, you have to cover it because they are definitely a part of history. I think it's just because they've lasted still, you know, through all of it, that it feels that way. That's the only reason why. I don't think it was intentionally made that way. But I will say that they have some very good non-ticketed video games at Dave & Buster's that I still enjoy, like the Luigi's Mansion game, where you get to have a like actual vacuum cleaner. You played that one? I'm a big fan of it.
I don't know. I have not played that one.
And then Tyler's pro expert game, Fireteam Raven. Halo.
Yeah,
Fireteam
I have
Raven.
played that one. Played that one start to finish on my work's dime. They gave us a card full of money, and I saw this Halo game, and I was like, I'm just going to play this start to finish. And some friends and I we just cruised right through it. Probably took us an hour to beat the whole thing.
Dude, I really want to do that still. I also didn't realize, like, looking into these, like, that Fireteam Raven these games cost a lot to make.
Yeah.
Do you get it? I think you get into that later in the chapter, do you?
I don't know if we get into the exact cost of them, but...
Well, I know Fireteam Raven cost $30,000 a machine, which is
whoa,
a lot of money.
We'll get into that a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit.
Because, yeah, that fact, later on in this whole chapter, I was like, wowzers, that's a lot of money. But, okay, so the book answers, though, a very important question that probably came to mind if you were reading this chapter. It definitely did to me, which is, why did Dave & Buster's make it and is still growing when all the other companies failed? And the answer is actually pretty simple. It's because Dave & Buster's has always marketed to adults and has always put food and drink first. There's the famous Nolan Bushnell quote about how he even said the pizza doesn't matter at Chuck E. Cheese. And then while I read that quote, I had a flashback to me being 8 years old and asking to drive to Anchorage, Alaska, an hour away from Eagle River, my hometown, where I grew up, to go see Chuck E. Cheese. And my dad exclaimed that he doesn't want to go there because, quote, their pizza tastes like cardboard. So that's why I think I love Dave & Buster's so much, is because my dad, didn't like Chuck E. Cheese. It's a daddy issue, essentially, with me. But I learned that while reading this chapter. I was like, it like all flashed in my head at once. So thank you, Stephen L. Kent. He's almost like a therapist for this for me a little bit.
Letting you figure your issues out.
I am.
Yeah, I haven't had Chuck E. Cheese pizza in probably 25 years. So I don't remember. I mean, I guess when you're a kid, everything tastes good. But as long as the right advertising is around it, which Chuck E. Cheese definitely had. But I bet it's terrible pizza.
Well, it's funny, too, because I said the thing earlier, and just now, while we're reading through this, Chuck E. Cheese still exists. Like, there's still a thing. There's actually a brand new Chuck E. Cheese in Tri-Cities, Tyler.
Yeah, well, that one has closed and reopened several times, I think, in my lifetime.
Yeah, well, I went to it like a year or two ago. I went to it with my former boss because I was there for comedy, but he lived there, and he's like, my daughter really wants to go to Chuck E. Cheese. I know we're going to hang out. Do you want to go? And I'm like, well, I mean, I love an arcade, so I'll go. And we didn't try the pizza, but it really was funny how I tried to count how many games didn't have tickets, and it was like on one hand.
Yeah, easily. And I bet those ones, nobody plays them.
Yeah, and it was like the big ones. It was like the one with like the Star Wars pod and like the Luigi's Mansions, like the House of the Dead, the ones that are like booths with like guns in them. It was those. They didn't really have any like fighting games at all, which is, and even for me, like, I think they only had one DDR machine, which I feel like that's like a arcade staple. You got to have Dance Dance Revolution if you're going to do that. But anyway, my last fun fact about Dave & Buster's, and I kind of briefly mentioned it at the very beginning with that Kevin Bacchus quote, is that Kevin Bacchus was a founding Xbox team member. And he is currently Dave & Buster's Senior Vice President of Entertainment and Game Strategy. And I was like, wow, talking about like Dave & Buster's like pulling talent, And also, this is the big fact, is that the revenue of Dave & Buster's yearly is $1.3 to $1.4 billion.
Oh my gosh, that is so much.
That's so much money. And I was just so surprised to hear that I actually stopped reading and I was like, whoa. Well, I didn't say whoa. I said an expletive, but I can't say on the podcast. But I was very surprised reading this in my hotel room. It really is because they just focus on the bar party life. And it works because now the bar party life people are people Tyler and I's age that grew up going to little arcades and Chuck E. Cheese. And now there's adult Chuck E. Cheese. So it's really genius when you think about it.
Yeah. Well, and we'll talk about it in a little bit too, but like the games get people in the door, and then it's like the food and drink that really that makes the money now. And that does some interesting things to the economics of arcades that we'll talk about later on in this chapter.
I didn't realize there was a parallel between arcades now and comedy clubs, because it's the exact same case at comedy clubs. Ticket sales, zero money made off ticket sales. It's entirely drinks and food. That's what clubs make. That's why they all have 2 item minimums.
Oh, I believe that. I bet they make enough from ticket sales to like pay the act, and then everything else on top of that is just food and drink, right? That would make sense.
Exactly. Usually the ticket sales go to the comics on the show.
Yeah.
And then especially sometimes it's like the entire door. If it's like a really big headliner, like if you have like, I want to say like DL Hughley or like Damon Wayans or like if you get like Mark Maron at a comedy club, it's going to be like the door deal is all going to the big comic, because then they can walk away with like thousands and thousands of dollars. And then the club is just like, yep, you better buy 2 overpriced beers because
and now the bar club is full of people buying drinks that we made them buy drinks.
Yeah. This is this is not a topic, but hey, it's our podcast. We can do what we want. Funny aside about comedy clubs. It's really funny when comedy clubs bring in new YouTube celebrities. This is like a thing that's been happening now for a couple of years. And it's really funny to watch because a lot of the times the people that come to those shows are under 18, and the look of disappointment when all these people are ordering sodas.
Oh, yeah.
Because the club doesn't they're like, we got to move these nachos, okay? Because we can't sell alcohol. It's just really funny to me. But sorry. Okay, that was my last aside. But I was really interested to know that arcades are running almost like financially very similarly to comedy clubs.
Yeah. And that Dave and Buster's makes $1.3 to $1.4 billion a year. I'm like, gosh, I'm in the wrong business.
Yeah, that's revenue too. That's like,
yeah. I mean, that's just so much money, but
it's so much money. I can't even fathom it.
Yeah. Then the next part of the book that has the sub headline, Refusing to Die. But before we dive into that, I want to make an observation here that I think maybe helps frame this a little bit. So in my mind, I think arcades have always been kind of about having an experience that you can't have at home. In the early days, that was like just the novelty of having an electronic game in a room was enough to draw people in, right? You couldn't play Pac-Man at home because they didn't. Were you going to buy an arcade and keep it at your home? No. But as home consoles became more and more prominent, the focus of arcade shifted more onto the technology, like games that could only exist in an arcade because of the technology required to run them. Early on in the console era, that was like arcades were just more powerful, and so the graphics were better. Do you remember in like the late 80s and early 90s how consoles kept selling themselves on that they were like arcade quality, like you would buy a Saturn or a Sega Genesis because you could play the same exact game at arcade quality, right? In a way that you wouldn't do now. Like you wouldn't say your Xbox Series X plays games at arcade quality. Like doesn't mean anything to you anymore, right?
Yeah, which is also why I'm sure all their games were mostly ports of arcade games at the time too.
Yeah. And that's just because arcades had better graphics. They had more specialized control schemes for games as well. And so many of the people thought of them as being like the superior experience that was only barely imitated by home consoles, but never duplicated. Well, as the 90s wore on and computer technology went absolutely like berserk, like if you look at a computer that was made in 1990 and compare it to one that was released in 2000, the difference, that 10-year span is so much different than a computer, say, that was made in 2011 and one that was made today. Like there's a big difference between a computer in 2011 and one made today, but you could still use it, right? If it was made in 2011, like it would still like be mostly usable, even if it's not 100% ideal. In 2000, if you're trying to use a 10-year-old computer, it was garbage. Like there was no reason to do that. And that's because technology was just moving so fast during those years, at least for computers. It still moves fast today, but for computers especially that was.
Do you remember like when we were kids on our 90s home computers, how much you'd have to wait?
Yeah.
And it was just normal to just wait. And now I get so mad if my Chrome browser takes like a second longer than it should loading.
Yeah. Do you remember you could have one web page open at a time, maybe two. Mm-hmm. And that was just normal. We didn't have tabs. Like the idea of tabs in your browser didn't make any sense because what would you ever need to have more than one website open at a time for? That would slow your computer down too much. You can't have 2 websites open at once.
Yeah, it's also why if I see someone not open a tab and open another browser window, I just get so upset.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh no, because you know the people I'm talking about doing that,
Oh yeah.
And it's just like, why are you doing this to me?
Yeah. You had to wait to sign on to the internet, you had to dial in. Everything just took time. You'd click a thing. If you had to burn a CD, I was reading a Reddit thread on this earlier today. Like you went to burn a CD and you couldn't even touch the computer. Like, because otherwise you'd get a buffer underrun and your blank CD was worthless. It was just completely destroyed. So you just had to like click the burn button and like creep away slowly from the computer so that it doesn't think that you were looking at it while it was trying to burn a CD. You remember that?
I do. The idea of like your computer like, don't look at me while I'm doing this.
So anyway, man. All that's to say is technology was getting pretty crazy in the 90s. It was growing very, very fast. And so what did arcades do to compete? They got more and more just ridiculous, right? Just like bigger and better.
I love it.
Yeah. So we'll go back to the book now at this point, but I just want to set this sort of the stage there as we enter sort of the 90s era of arcades, or the late 90s. So Midway released their last game in 2001. It was called The Grid. It was a third-person shooter made by Ed Boon, who's the creator of Mortal Kombat, and that was their last arcade game. For the next 8 years of operation, they just made console games. So when Midway closed their arcade operations in 2001, one of their designers, arcade game legend Eugene Jarvis, became a free agent, and he had a great idea. Since PCs were getting so great these days, what if instead of making all this specialized hardware for each arcade machine, we just used standard PC technology? That stuff was getting better and better every year, and a specialized arcade company really couldn't do anything to compete because there was just so much money in the marketplace of building better and better computers. And there was no need for that. And so what he said was, if you can't beat them, join them. And so by using PC tech, they had an advantage. Also using PC tech had an advantage that Jarvis pointed out. So consoles have like distinct generations or cycles, right? They get better every 4 to 5 years. You get a PlayStation 3. 5 years later, you get a PlayStation 4, or 7 years later, or whatever. And that's like they sort of move in chunks like that. But PCs get better all the time. So every time you make a new game, you can use better technology in it. So they sort of rode that wave of PCs getting better. And he founded a company called Raw Thrills. And this is an important company because they're kind of I don't want to say they're the only arcade company these days doing anything, but they're one of the few arcade companies that are really, really successful these days. Because arcades were like, they're definitely on their way out in the late 2000s. You knew it, I knew it, everybody knew it. Who in their right mind would start a new company around the idea of making new arcade games? It's Eugene Jarvis. That's who.
He did it. I actually thought this part of the book was very exciting to me because it's like new history.
Yeah.
You know, and that is such a risk. The risk of starting an arcade company in the late 2000s.
If I had known what I know, if I had been a 30-year-old man in 2001 and I saw that old arcade legend Eugene Jarvis goes to make a new arcade company in 2001, I'd be like, oh, this guy just knows how to do one thing and he's not willing to change with the times. He's just going to keep doing the same stuff. Which ended up working out for him, but I would not have guessed that it would work out for him. And that's why I'm not a fortune teller, I guess.
Yeah, but that's why we'll be future arcade owners.
That's why we'll just have old games because we clearly can't predict the future. We only talk about old games. So Raw Thrills started out making a licensed Fast and the Furious game, but it was taking too long and they kind of needed to get something else out quicker. So they made a game called Target Terror, which was this like crazy on-rails shooter that had all this like crazy wacky stuff in it, including actual people, not 3D rendered people, like they filmed stuff for it. The bonus rounds had players shooting at turkeys and suicide vests or like shooting exploding golf balls at terrorists. It was like pretty over the top in its portrayal of fighting terrorism, to the point where it just feels like a ridiculous parody. The ending has players stopping a hijacked 747 from crashing into the White House, which is just a crazy scenario. You could play with 2 players, or 1 player could play with both guns in what they called justice mode.
That's great. When I read that, I was so excited. I was like, yes.
Justice mode.
Because we all do it anyway.
Yeah, that's true. So when they made the game, they made it in a way that they knew they'd also be able to bring it to console if they had to recoup costs. They knew they were in risky territory here, and like maybe arcades were on their way out, and they would need sort of an exit strategy if they weren't able to make money off this. They did eventually bring this game out on the Wii. It was horrible. It got a lot of bad awards, like Razzies, but whatever the video game equivalent of Razzies are. But the experience made them think that arcade games and console games are just so different that it's not worth trying to design for both. You design for one or the other, or you end up with something that just doesn't feel good on both. So they committed fully to arcade games. And at this point, Kent notes that the arcade audience had evolved and Raw Thrills evolved with it. They decided to make these over-the-top games like Target Terror that might grab a dad's attention at an arcade, rather than design games for like a hardcore arcade enthusiast. Because like our hardcore arcade enthusiasts, if they even existed anymore, were such a small audience that they weren't worth making games for. But like a person just walking by a really crazy looking game called Target Terror might stop and pop $1 in there, right? And shoot some bad guys, I guess. So they wanted games that like would make people look at it and just be like, what the heck is this? When they saw it at the arcade. They did eventually release that Fast and Furious game in 2004, and it was a hit despite not having any likenesses or any of the Fast and the Furious characters in it. But dudes at Dave & Buster's like Fast and Furious movies, and I count myself among those dudes. And so the game did really well.
I think I remember this game.
Yeah, did you ever play it?
I think my brother and I played it at an arcade once because like because I'm like this. I think it's still out in arcades. This Fast and Furious with no licensing, because that's what I feel like I played this because I remember being like, why can't I be Dom Toretto? You know?
Yeah. Nope. It's just a Fast and Furious game without Dom Toretto. Yeah. You're just really weird
why is
to
he not
think of.
Screaming into my ear about family as I drive? What is happening?
Yeah. Do it for the family. But and this also, like, because the game did so well, it sort of let them know how well licensed games could do too. Because when you're walking by a crazy arcade cabinet, you look over and you say, "Oh, I like Fast and Furious," and then you also see that it's this like ridiculous driving game that fits with Fast and Furious. You're like, "Yeah, I'll pop a couple bucks in and see what this is all about." So they continued making licensed arcade games for Fast and Furious. So they made a few of those. They also made some games for Nickelodeon, and they made the arcade version of Guitar Hero as well, which I have played. And I think it's not great, not because there's anything wrong with like what they did, but because there's like music is so important to that game. And like there's sounds of like, there's so many sounds at a arcade.
Yeah.
And they're just like, if you're trying to play a Guitar Hero song, you need the song there. And if there's all these other all these other arcade games that are all loud and fighting for your attention as well, it makes it hard to concentrate, makes it hard to follow along with the song. And I just don't think Guitar Hero works well as an arcade game because of that.
Which is funny because I feel like it's very popular at Dave & Buster's when I go there though. Like
Yeah.
I always, it's a very like couples arcade game. I see a lot of like couples on it, like people on
okay.
dates. They're like, let's play Guitar Hero, like make eyes at each other and then not do very well in the song because we can't hear the music.
Yeah, all right. I also feel like the arcade the guitar is like always broken too.
It is 100%. And I would say this game needs like headphones, but then I'm like, well, the idea of sharing headphones with like, even if they're just over the ear ones with like all these
Still
random
gross.
strangers is still gross, especially now.
Super gross. Yeah.
It needs a booth.
What?
Like a booth you walk into. Like that's what it could do.
Like a karaoke, there's like karaoke bars where you go and perform to a bunch of strangers, and there's also like karaoke rooms where you go with just your friends and sing karaoke.
I was at a mall in Vancouver, Washington, and they had karaoke booths for like 2 or 3 people that were like lining the walls of this like empty storefront because they just wanted to fill it with something. And I'm like, you make those Guitar Hero. Boom.
Yep.
Look at that.
Boom.
Sorry, we don't need to fix Guitar Hero right now, but I feel like I should because I know Tyler loves Guitar Hero.
I do love Guitar Hero.
I want to fix it for you.
Yeah. So in 2014, Raw Thrills bought a company called Play Mechanics, which had also been started by a former Midway arcade veteran named George Petro. So the band was kind of getting back together here a little bit. Play Mechanics made cooler games with more ambiance. Kent says that their Terminator cabinet was 85 inches tall, 98 inches wide, and weighed 562 pounds. So this thing was a beast.
Absurd.
Yeah. So they had also figured out this like bigger is louder and crazier is better for arcade games. Play Mechanics also made a very popular arcade series called the Big Buck Hunter series. Are you familiar with those games, Mike?
I love Big Buck Hunter. Like I have zero interest in hunting in real life.
Yeah.
But I feel so when you hit all the bucks and don't hit any of the does and you like do the level perfectly, it feels so good. Like the adrenaline boost I get is just perfect.
I agree. I have a friend who has played Buck Hunter professionally and does very well at Buck Hunter tournaments. I watched her play Buck Hunter on Twitch at like Buck Hunter Worlds like 3 or 4 years ago, and it is crazy. Like they do not mess around in the pro Buck Hunter world. They go hard.
We should have her on the podcast. I think
that would be really super fun
to do the history of Buck Hunter with a person who's a professional Buck Hunter player. It's a great idea, right?
That is a great idea. I'll reach out to her.
Not to toot my own horn, but you should message her. This is a great idea.
Yeah, that would be really fun. Pro Buck Hunter is wild, and it is its own world.
I want to watch this video. Can you send it to me? And I'll put it on. We should put it on the Discord too, so people can look at it. Because if you can find a video of it, I would love to watch it.
I'm sure I can. I'll look around. No promises, but I'll look around. So anyway, I just wanted to flex that I know somebody who plays professional Buck Hunter in tournaments. Anyway, raw thrills and play mechanics started to tap into this growing trend also of classic games, but huge. So have you seen those like gigantic Pac-Man and Space Invaders games at Dave & Buster's? Those games are made by Raw Thrills.
I was smiling ear to ear when I read this part because I've seen them and I love them. And I think it's so fun.
Yes, I think it's perfect because it's an experience that is extremely familiar. They have gigantic Pac-Man, I think Space Invaders, maybe a couple others. It's extremely familiar. We all know those games. We all know Pac-Man. We all know Space Invaders. But it's also super foreign in this kind of large context, right? Like they're huge. They're like measured in feet and how like big they are, right? And they're completely impossible to do at home. Like you're not buying one of these to play at home. So like you hear people say things like, oh yeah, you got to go check out the giant Pac-Man at Dave & Buster's sometimes. It's crazy. And the Space Invaders one is even more nuts because they added like blasters to it. So you're not just playing Space Invaders on a huge screen, but you're like playing it differently on a huge screen. Yeah. And they were huge hits.
Quick aside too, taking these classic games and modifying them. One of my favorite arcade games is 4-player Pac-Man where you're all playing against each other.
Oh, and yeah.
The best part about the game is you put your money in and you're guaranteed like a full game. Like there will be a winner. There's like, I think there's 2 or 3 rounds. So you get like, it's a good amount of game and you get these power-ups that make your Pac-Man just huge. So you can like get everyone. It's really fun. It's one of my favorite games to play at the arcade with other people.
Oh man, that sounds great.
Yeah. I just want to throw that out there.
Competitive PvP Pac-Man.
It's PvP Pac-Man.
Wow.
And it is super fun. And there's ghosts to get and like stuff and power-ups to get. So it's worth to get the dots.
Yeah.
So you can get the power-ups to show up on the stage. And then there's also this like strategy of like, well, maybe I shouldn't get the dots because maybe I should let them get the dots. So I race to the other. It's fun. You can get like very simple, silly mind games. And then you also get the fun experience of like looking down on that flat table, but it's really big and it's the screen and it's really neat. I played it at Ground Control, which was actually mentioned in this chapter, and I loved it. So
I will check it out next time I'm at like Dave & Buster's or something.
Yeah, it's sometimes at Dave & Buster's, it's sometimes not. The one I played on was Ground Control in Portland, Oregon, which is yeah. So yeah, sorry, quick tangent, but I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. Well, these giant arcade things, kind of like giant versions of older arcade games, marked a shift in the arcade market. Because in the early days, when you were in arcade, games were your business. Like you were trying to get quarters into machines, right? That's what mattered. So the cost of the machines and the design of the games was very important in bringing in money because you needed people putting quarters in and you needed to make sure that if I spend $3,000 on an arcade machine that I can bring in, at least I think the number that Kent uses in the book is like it needed to bring in 6 times the amount of money that the arcade cabinet costs for it to be worth it to the arcade. So like that, the economics of the individual machines mattered a lot. But in the 2000s, it started to change. So the main money makers at a place like Dave & Buster's are not actually the games themselves anymore. Those are the attractions that get people in the door. They're part of a larger business. And so like at Dave & Buster's, they've got food, pool, a bar, and an arcade, right? They've got something for everyone. Arcades are just a part of it. And also a big part of it is those redemption games with tickets, which I don't think Dave & Buster's uses physical tickets anymore. It's all on
it's all cards, and then it's like on your phone you can check your account. It's like all integrated.
Yeah. But I think the biggest thing that endured from Chuck E. Cheese is not the cardboard pizza, but the feeling people get when they turn their tickets in, like they earned something, like they got one up on the house, right? Like they even have stuff like Xboxes at Dave & Buster's, or at least I think it was GameWorks that I was at where they had like Xbox Ones behind the thing.
Oh, they're definitely at Dave & Buster's too. And there was like a whole Reddit thread about a guy who like he claims his job was to go to these places and like cheat the system so he can get like $100 Xbox and then resell it.
Oh, he had like a system for getting tickets.
It's like, yeah, there's a couple games that sometimes you can like, if you can get good at them, like you have to be good at them. Yeah. And you have to have like good muscle memory. You can like hit the jackpot every time. And Dave & Buster's is always on the hunt to like stop this from happening. It's actually a thing. And I've also heard of it happening with skee ball as well. Like you can kind of play skee ball depending on how much it plays out. But this is also like a thread on the Reddit and you're like, is this real? Because if it's not, it's a great story. But I'm like, I don't believe it. Because I've gone there and tried to play some of these games they mentioned. Because they mentioned like Flappy Tickets is one. So hard. The Stacker one, that's also very hard. But yeah, it's a thing.
I kind of assume that at least for games that don't have a physical component to it, like so Skee Ball is maybe different, but like for those games that have some sort of big jackpot, that there's like that the machine is sort of working against you in that like it's only going to pay out a big prize if it's already taken in enough money to cover it and more, you know? So that like a person who buys one of these arcade things they know that they're going to make a certain amount of money off of it. Like, so I just assume that it's rigged against you in that way. Like it's strange to me to think that there's like a person who can be good enough at these games to do that. Cause I just assume they're rigged.
Well, and I think they are, like, as in, like, once a stacker machine or a Flappy Tickets hits a jackpot point, it'll, like, make it so it's harder to hit the jackpot, you know, like...
Yeah, until just it's taken in another like 10,000 tickets worth of...
Yeah, because they're essentially slot machines with games attached to them. Like, that's what it is, but... The people that's why they find the games that they can like mess with. So I think they're just banking on people like us, you know, people that are just going to go in and be like, spend a couple bucks. It was fun. Yeah. And that's their money. They're not banking on someone that's going to dedicate their life to getting very good at the stacker game, which there's people out there though, you know? So
yeah. Yeah. I assume that like most people who get an Xbox at a Dave and Buster's got this $300 Xbox because they spent $6,000 in games. You know, and it's like Dave Buster's like, thanks for spending so much money here. Here's an Xbox. Yep.
Here's an Xbox. You earned it, but I mean, you could have just bought it, but you earned it from us.
You got one over on us.
Yeah.
There are other places too, like these family entertainment centers is what they're called in the book, FECs. That they're like, there's other places that have like water parks or even bigger attractions than just arcades. And what they're trying to do is avoid what is called, according to Howard McAuliffe, the veto move. So one of his clients is Shakey's Pizza. He works for Pinnacle Entertainment Group, and one of his clients is Shakey's Pizza, which has pizza, sure, but it also has a salad bar. So that you don't have like that one person in the family who's like eating healthy or whatever, just completely shoot down the idea because everybody's like, let's go get pizza. And then that person goes, well, I'm trying to eat healthy. And they can go, well, they have a salad bar. And then that person can't like say no, you know? They're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll have a salad.
Yeah, so, they also, is this where they talk about Bullwinkles? Because...
I don't think so.
Is it later on? Did you mention Bullwinkles in these notes? Because
no, I don't think so.
That's a family fun center they talk about, and it's in Tuckwell. It's about 10 minutes from my house right now, and I spent some time at Bullwinkles, and it was just very interesting to see. I think that's maybe why this chapter is so great to me. Is they mention a lot of things that I've been to.
Like the Northwest.
Like Ground Control in Portland, like all these places that I've gone to and I really enjoy. But it's really interesting to think about how these places stay open. And Bullwinkles is the same way. It's like, it's got an arcade. It's also got mini golf. It's got bumper cars. It's got those bumper boats that you can't, like, you have to like have all these things. So that, like you said, the veto rule, it's something I never would have thought about, you know, which is why I'm not a salesman. But hey, you know, it's interesting. It's very interesting to me.
Arcades are just part of it, and even if the arcade section like itself makes a loss on like just taking in quarters, that's fine because it allowed people to get in the door to go do mini golf, to go eat food, to go do whatever, right? The other stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's these like gigantic family entertainment centers, but then like there's also like sort of an opposite trend happening these days with what is called the barcade, even though barcade is like actually a trademarked copyrighted term that you should not be calling your barcade a barcade. It's like Kleenex or Band-Aid or Coke, you know?
Yeah.
But they're these establishments that are usually themed around video games and video game nostalgia, and they use classic arcade machines to get people in the door to buy food and drinks also. But they usually have like lower end, like smaller, like a lot of times it's classic games. Like they just have a row of Pac-Man machines or Space Invaders or like all these older games. They like get people in the door with nostalgia, and then they buy like $13 craft beers, right? Like that's
and
where
this is also usually where you see those fun gems like the 4-player Pac-Man and like those kind of games. And Ground Control, I think, was one of the early games, like companies with it. The New York one that took Barcade is, but now they're kind of everywhere. Like I feel like most towns have barcades now, which is great.
Yeah, there's one in my town now in Sherman Oaks called the One Up. So you can guess what the theme is there. It's all video games.
Do you go there? Have you gone there before?
I have been there, yeah. It's pretty cool.
Nice.
I like it a lot, actually. I should go there more often, to be honest. And I don't even play games when I go there. I just like the atmosphere of like being around them. I don't even play the games.
Dude,
I don't know. There's just something about it that I
you
like.
know how we always talk about like our hours on Steam in a certain game?
Yeah.
We should have another stat that's just talking about video games, because I think I like that more almost than playing video. Like when someone comes to me and they're like, "Oh, you like video games?" I love just talking nonsense about it. And that's,
same.
I think that's the same thing with like when you go to these barcades, just the lights and the sounds, and you're there, and even watching, because I love watching other people play video games, so just watching other people play them, like it's just it's my favorite thing. So
yeah, and if you were to like bring up a video game or like sort of make a reference to a video game or something, nobody's gonna look at you sideways and be like, "Oh, we're talking about video games now." Like you're in a barcade, it's not weird to talk about video games in a barcade, right?
Barcades, comic book shops, they're just the places I like to be.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. There's also like more authentic 80s arcades operating too, that I think are running mostly on nostalgia, which is a powerful drug, Mike. We know this.
Fast. I had no idea. Like, whereas everything else in this chapter, I'm like, yeah, barcades, yeah, Dave and Buster's, yeah, like family fun centers. I did not know this was a thing.
Yeah. They are really going for recreating the authentic 80s experience. And I think it's funny because I'm 31 years old and I've spent some time in arcades as a kid in the 90s, but like, and this was like mid to late 90s is probably my earliest memories of being in an arcade, but that's like definitely like late in the game, right? Like that's after their heyday. But there's something about a vintage 80s arcade that still feels nostalgic even for me, and I can't explain it. Like maybe it's from watching 80s movies growing up or something. I don't know. Do you ever like have that feeling of like nostalgia for an era you didn't grow up in?
Oh, 100%. Yes. And I think it's because of like that, the Wiz.
Yeah.
Like that movie, and like just like Ready Player One gave me those vibes so strong, and I was like so into it, and I'm like, I've never been to an 80s arcade. I was not born. It just didn't exist, and I still feel that way. Like the lighting, the sound, it has to be a completely dark and just black lights. That's to me what an arcade is.
Like neon lights.
Yep.
Yeah. I think some of this like nostalgia for eras that we didn't grow up in is like kind of powering this recent renaissance of 80s themed things. Like, so there's people that grew up in the 80s that are in their 40s now, right? Like nobody in the 80s is a young person who was born in the 80s is like super young. And I think even these Generation Z Zoomers have like 80s nostalgia, right? And they were born in the 2000s. So like, I don't know, maybe there's something about that time period in general. I don't know. But if you're listening to this and you've ever experienced nostalgia for an era you didn't participate in, please send us an email about why you think that might be, like what that means for you. Cause that's like, I think that's really interesting. A really interesting thought. And I wonder if it has happened with other time periods as well. Like were people who were adults in our time, like nostalgic for like the 40s, right? In an era they didn't grow up in, or the 50s in an era they didn't grow up in? I think
100%. Like look at just like, look at dads and trains, you know, like the 50s, like this is like the golden age of trains, you know?
Yeah.
It's not going to be now.
That's
like dads that love World War II era planes. That's a huge thing. World War II era stuff in general. Like that's big, you know?
Yeah. So like the rest of this chapter is like kind of talking about some specific arcades that are still in operation. I think maybe Bullwinkle's is among those.
Bullwinkle's, he mentions Ground Control. Yeah, those ones.
Yeah. And these are ones that have sort of managed to change with the times and keep people coming back. There was one of them that actually even released a previously unfinished and unreleased game called The Spectre Files Deathstalker, which was like a full motion video game on Laserdisc, kind of like Dragon's Lair. That they only ever shot the footage for it, and they never actually programmed a game for it. So they finished it and they brought it out as like this lost game from the 80s, which I think is just cool, just beautiful, right? They worked with the original creators. They finished this game that was started in 1984. I think that's super cool.
Yeah, the one that really got me was when the guy who owns the arcade, it had like 700 machines or something. I think his name's Doc is his name. He's what he like, and he told, because he would have the meetups with the people that created the games, and he's in Chicago, so like a lot of them still live there. And he told one of them that his favorite game was this game that this guy worked on. And the guy went and programmed a version of the board that has a level that was cut in production and gave it to the guy. Like, this is your favorite game. You're the only one that has this copy of this game with this level that was cut out last minute. I put it in there for you. And it's just like, wow. Like the guy just did it because he knew the other guy just loved the game. And that was like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So nice.
So yeah, I think in the end, the like kind of the moral of the story here is that today arcades are kind of doing okay. They're not the same as they were back in the day. They're not standalone environments where people go just to play games, but they're in like those family entertainment centers like Dave and Buster's. They're making kind of a comeback among the hipster crowd with barcades, getting people in the door to play Pac-Man before drinking like really expensive beer. It's not quite the same as it was back in the day, but you know, nothing's the same as it was back in the day. And I'm glad that they have hung around. So they like kind of had a big increase, and then there was sort of a bubble that popped there. And like in the like mid late 90s, early 2000s, we had an arcade drought, and now they're like starting to come back a little bit, and probably what's a more sustainable form. And I think that's great, and I'm really excited for that. And I love going to Dave and Buster's, so I'm going to keep doing that.
Me too. I also think like even more recently, and this is just me talking about what I've seen, but I went to Ground Control in like 2012 for the first time, and then that was successful. And for about 4 or 5 years after that, there were barcades popping up all over Seattle. Yeah. And I don't know if it was their business model, but they would usually close within like a year or two. So I think it's there's still barcades that have like established themselves. There's one in Tacoma called Dorky's that's been there for a long time. But it's definitely like a bubble that burst that's kind of regrowing again. And then COVID kind of made it so, like everything, it's very difficult right now. Bad. But so support your local barcade or family fun center or Dave and Buster's or whatever you like, because it is an experience, like you said, Tyler. And I love it. And I also love when I was in the Vancouver Mall, like for a comedy show, I just drove to the mall to go look at the non-Dave and Buster's arcade and look at all the weird machines. And they had some great machines I'd never seen before that were there because they were ridiculous. Like a Jurassic Park Jeep game for tickets that you were just gambling that the Jeep stopped on the right line. And I didn't play any of these games. I just walked around, but I was just like, yeah, this is why I like arcades, because I'm never going to see this at home, you know?
Yeah.
As much as I want a Time Crisis machine in my basement, it's just not feasible. Like, there's no way.
Yep. It's not going to happen.
Not going to happen. But yeah. So, this chapter was so fun. I love this one a lot.
Yeah, I like that we caught up with arcades, because some people might say arcades are dead, and while they're definitely not what they used to be, they're still around.
We need to find. There was a listener that emailed us that said they're opening a barcade, and I want an update.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to search through our email and try to find it, but they said they were opening a barcade, and they invited us, which was very kind, but they were in like South Carolina, I want to say. But I was very excited to hear that, and I was like, yeah, that's awesome. You're living your dream, you know?
Yep.
It's real nice.
Yeah. Well, Mike, what have you been playing?
I have had a pretty good week for video games. I beat Ghostbusters probably 4 hours ago while I was on the plane flying back from my comedy club weekend in Michigan. That's a really great game. The Ghostbusters is a video game. I played the remastered version on Switch. The only complaint I had was the Switch loading screens, because I'm sure it doesn't do that on Xbox or PlayStation, but it was really fun. Beat that, and then I played Destiny with you a little bit, and I also played through. I started Zelda up again because I beat Ghostbusters. So like I finished Ghostbusters about halfway through my flight, and then I just put the Skyward Sword back in. Or not even put it in; it was on there. I just opened it up and just started playing Skyward Sword, and I'm back in. It was kind of a good break, but I'm back in it. I'm on the late. I always mispronounce it. It's Lanayru, right? The Lanayru Sand Sea, where you're on the boat, but the boat's in the past, so you're actually going through the ocean, and there's sand all around you in like a little bubble. And I just got to the sand ship, and I'm really digging this part. Like as far as like looks go, it's really cool. And I just got the bow and arrow, so I'm super stoked about it because I mean, Link's got to have a bow and arrow, right? Yep. Feels good. But yeah, I'm into that, and I kind of wish I might start talking about it more in length at the end of an episode sometime because I'm loving Zelda so much. And I covered it technically on the podcast, but now that I played it, I'm like, there's so much more I want to talk about. But what have you been playing?
I'm still boring this week. I've just been playing Destiny, man. When I get time to play games, it's all Destiny all the time. To our listeners who do play Destiny, I finally got the gun 1000 Voices. So if you play Destiny, maybe you know how.
You texted me.
Yeah, maybe you know how wonderful it is that I finally got this gun. If you don't know about Destiny, then continue living your life. It's fine. But yeah, I'm pretty boring in that sense.
boring.
Sorry.
You got 1,000 voices.
I know, but
That
I wish I
just
had
takes-
more games to talk about.
I wish I could have been. Were you like? Did you scream? Did you yell really loud when you got it? Were you
No, it was like
excited?
2 a.m. I was like, I played it real cool because I was me and a friend and then a bunch of other randos, and I just wanted to play it cool, for the randos.
Because when it dropped for me the week before, I was like muted myself and was like, "Oh yeah!" I was like, really excited.
I should have muted myself. Yeah, I just played it cool.
There's something about when you get the RNG weapon drop in Destiny, like when I got the Gjallarhorn it just felt really good. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons the game's so popular, which is funny because RNG, it's gambling in a video game.
That's all it is. Yep. I just play for pulls on the slot machine. But
exactly.
I find the game fun regardless. So.
It's fun to shoot aliens.
I like it. Yep.
I'm so happy for you. And now we can just melt bosses together.
Yeah.
It's so fun. We got 2 emails. Yeah, let's do these 2 emails real quick. This is a long episode, but I'm into it. I got really excited about this one. So the first one's from Burger Champ. Remakes and remasters seem to be all the rage these days. The subject of this email is remasters of the universe, which is a great subject.
That's a good subject.
Most of the games getting updates or definitive editions are slightly better versions of games that are popular and still stand up on their own. Query: what game or franchise that almost achieved greatness, maybe a game where problematic controls or outdated and questionable cultural depictions hold it back, or a game with great ideas infected with a straight-up jank, would you like to see remastered to reach its full potential on modern hardware? I look forward to the inevitable HD remastered legacy definitive ultimate game of the year enhanced director's cut anniversary special collector's edition redux of Codex hitting the feed in 2027. Burger Champ. Oh, well, the first game that I want remade just for graphic reasons, and I've mentioned it a lot when we talk about 64, is I have a hardcore nostalgia, actually for 2 games, for Snowboard Kids and for that Star Wars Racer pod racing game.
That one did just get a remaster pretty recently.
Oh, it did? Well,
it's on Switch now, yeah.
It's on Switch? Well, there you go. So I take that back. Snowboard Kids, that is my big one. But for a PC game that I think was pretty fun, but also had really horrible controls, that could, I mean, obviously you can map the controls, but was also really hard, like difficulty-wise was really hard, and I stopped playing it at the very beginning, was the original Far Cry. I would want the modern treatment put on that game, because I feel like games with
that one's rough,
outrageous difficulty and controls that are not modern, it was just even harder for me to figure it out. And I could have remapped it, but I was like, it's not even worth the time because this game's so hard to me. I just stopped playing it. What about you, Tyler?
I think my answer to this is a game series that I've talked a lot about and love that has had a remaster in that it was like an up-res port, but the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games, I guess only the first 2 got, or the second and third got the remaster. So maybe my answer is just Metal Gear Solid, but it also got remastered with Twin Snakes. So anyway, those games, the controls don't hold up very well. I would love to see a more thorough remake of them, like Resident Evil 2 style, rather than just like a port or like an enhanced port to a different system. Metal Gear Solid 4, I think, still holds up pretty well on the gameplay front. I still love the story, but it's definitely different for different people. People like that game. I love it.
I tried to play Metal Gear like that one time, and I was really confused by the controls. And obviously I could have put in more effort. I could have Googled some things. I could have watched some guides, but I was just kind of like, nah, right now, like, nah.
It's pretty rough. Twin Snakes is a little bit better than the original, but it's still the first 3 are still pretty rough.
I played whatever the thing was on Xbox. I don't know if it was Twin Snakes. I think it was just because I downloaded it by itself, so I don't think it was Twin Snakes.
Oh, right. If you download it by itself, then it was either 2, 3, or Peace Walker. Actually, by itself, it would have been Peace Walker because 2 and 3, I think, are together.
Oh, it was 1, though. I thought maybe it was Twin Snakes then.
No,
one was on
Xbox.
One's
not on Xbox. The first one is not on Xbox.
Well, then I don't know what I did, but it was hard. That's a great question, though.
Yeah. We got another email here. This one's from Rick. He says, "Hi guys, need advice. Hi guys, I recently broke my right hand rescuing Peach from Bowser with John Glames and Jaybird. I tripped over a spider butt, and wouldn't you know it, a Bowser hammer smashed my pinky metacarpal. So now I'm down to 1 hand for the next 4 to 6 weeks, and I was halfway through Metroid Dread too. I guess my question is, do you guys know of any good games you can play with 1 hand? Happy fall and keep on being great. Typed with my stupid left hand, Rick." First of all, your left hand is not stupid. Left hand is the best hand.
Are you left-handed?
In many things, not everything. I have a pretty even split, actually. between what I do. It's super weird, and I can't skateboard because of it, because I push with my left foot, but I ride the board regular, and it's a really weird shift that has to happen when I skateboard, and I didn't realize it for many years, but that's why I'm bad at skateboarding.
But if you didn't have that, then you'd be a pro skater, and we wouldn't have this podcast.
You're right, that's true. So it all worked out in the end.
It really did.
Yeah, I eat left-handed, except if it's chopsticks, then it's right-handed. I think because it's a similar, because I write right-handed, so I think chopsticks is a similar dexterity
Interesting.
thing. Anyway, yeah.
How did I not know this about you?
I don't know. It's weird. Anyway, your left hand's not stupid, Rick. For one-handed video games, I'm going to have to go with a good old JRPG, like Final Fantasy X specifically, because there's no reaction time necessary in the battle system for Final Fantasy X.
So that's my recommendation. I thought of two games. I thought of Darkest Dungeon, because that's not based on timing at all. Mm-hmm. But if you got a Switch because you're playing Metroid Dread, I haven't played this game, but I love Fire Emblem, and I'm sure Fire Emblem Three Houses would be a good one for that too. Fire
Emblem 3 Houses?
Is it 3? Is it 3 houses? Or that's right?
No, it's Fire Emblem : 3 Houses. I just like calling it Fire Emblem 3 : Houses.
Okay. I'm like, am I confused? What's happening? That would be my recommendation. But yeah, I'm bummed. I'm sorry about Metroid Dread. But you know what? You'll heal up, and then you'll be probably, it's like when you take a break from video games and you beat the boss, you're just going to beat the whole game. You're just so good.
You will rescue Peach from Bowser's Castle. You won't even need John Glames and Jaybird to get you there.
You'll do it by yourself. It'll be wonderful. Cool. Well, I think that's all the emails for today. This was a long episode, but it was fun, and I really enjoyed it, and I love this chapter. So next week, we'll do chapter 9. I think we're just kind of going to do one chapter at a time. I think that works best for us. We're not rushed, and then we can just get really, go on these tangents like we do, which is our favorite thing. Well, mine, anyway. I
like it.
Oh, good. Okay. I was always just am I just making Tyler go along for the ride with this? Okay. But you can, if you want to send us an email, you can do that at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can join our Discord. If you want an invite to that, just email us, or you can go to my Twitter profile @Mikaleta, click the invite at the top of my profile. It's the pinned tweet there, and join it. Never expires. Tyler's also on Twitter @SneakerElf, ELPH. And we'd love to hear about your arcade nostalgia, because boy, I didn't realize I had so much until I read this chapter, and it really hit me in the feels. So there you go. But Tyler, with that, you want to say bye to everybody?
Yeah. Goodbye, everybody.